There are places that look digitally manipulated, but they are real. Dunes holding lagoons, deserts turning into mirrors, mountains rising above the clouds, and seas that glow at night. Around the planet, nature itself has built landscapes that challenge scale, color, and form. In this episode, we will travel through 25 of these places and understand why they are considered the most beautiful on Earth. And before we continue the journey, if this kind of visual exploration interests you, subscribe to the channel and tell me which part of the world you're watching from. Seen from space, Earth reveals no borders. What appears are volumes: mountain ranges, continuous deserts, dense patches of forest, vast surfaces of ice. Each of these forms carries a physical story: pressure, erosion, plate collisions, rainfall cycles. Throughout this episode, we will cross continents to observe 25 places where these processes created landscapes beyond the usual scale. When people talk about the most beautiful places on Earth, the choice is never purely aesthetic. Some impress by their scale, others by their rarity. There are landscapes that exist only under very specific conditions, an exact combination of altitude, climate, and soil composition. In this list, every place was selected because it presents something difficult to find anywhere else on the planet. Some places appear static in photographs, but in reality, they reveal constant movement. Water advances, ice retreats, light changes the color of rock within minutes. Part of the beauty lies in that variation. Many of these landscapes never repeat themselves in exactly the same way. What you see today may not look the same tomorrow. The Grand Canyon does not depend on a favorable angle. It imposes itself through sheer scale. More than 400 kilometers long, it was carved primarily by the Colorado River over millions of years. The visible layers in its walls expose different geological periods. Each band of color corresponds to a distinct phase in Earth's history. The northern lights are not rare by chance. They depend on solar activity and an atmosphere capable of interacting with charged particles coming from space. When these particles reach the upper layers of the atmosphere, they release energy in the form of light. The result is continuous movement across the sky that never repeats itself exactly the same way. At 8,848 meters of elevation, Everest is the highest point on Earth's surface above sea level. It is part of the Himalayan mountain range, formed by the collision between the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates. At the summit, winds can easily exceed 150 kilometers per hour. The mountain continues to grow a few millimeters every year. The Sahara covers about 9 million square kilometers in northern Africa. Not all of its territory is made of dunes. There are rocky plateaus, dry valleys, and areas of exposed gravel. In some regions, the temperature difference between day and night exceeds 30 degrees. Wind is the main agent shaping the landscape. Lençóis Maranhenses does not function like a typical desert. Between January and June, rainwater accumulates in depressions between the dunes and forms temporary freshwater lagoons. The soil beneath the sand is impermeable, preventing rapid infiltration. The result is a field of white dunes interspersed with hundreds of natural pools. The Great Barrier Reef stretches for more than 2,300 kilometers along the northeast coast of Australia. It is the largest reef system on the planet, formed by billions of tiny organisms known as corals. From above, it looks like a sequence of turquoise patches. Underwater, it reveals a complex structure built slowly over thousands of years. Salar de Uyuni sits more than 3,600 meters above sea level in southwestern Bolivia. It is the largest salt desert in the world, the remnant of ancient prehistoric lakes that evaporated. During the rainy season, a thin layer of water covers the flat surface. When this happens, the horizon almost disappears. Iguazu Falls includes around 275 waterfalls, spread across nearly 3 kilometers of the Iguazu River. The water drops from an average height of 60 to 80 meters. The volume varies throughout the year, but even during drier periods, the width of the system is impressive. The current formation is the result of basalt fractures associated with ancient volcanic flows. Antarctica contains about 90% of the planet's ice. In some places, the ice sheet exceeds 4 kilometers in thickness. There are no permanent cities, only seasonal scientific research stations. The landscape is defined by compressed ice, constant winds, and long periods of daylight or darkness depending on the season. Torres del Paine lies in Chilean Patagonia, near the southern Patagonian icefield. The granite towers that give the park its name were exposed after millions of years of glacial erosion. The weather changes quickly. In a single day, it is common to experience strong winds, clear skies, and low clouds covering the peaks. Petra was carved directly into sandstone more than 2,000 years ago by the Nabateans. The city prospered as a strategic point along desert trade routes. The color of the facades changes throughout the day, depending on how sunlight hits the minerals in the rock. More than the buildings themselves, what stands out is the integration between architecture and the natural landscape. Machu Picchu was built in the 15th century, at more than 2,400 meters above sea level, on a narrow ridge in the Peruvian Andes. The city was designed with agricultural terraces, residential areas, and ceremonial structures. The stones were fitted together without mortar. The elevated position keeps the site surrounded by steep slopes and mountain vegetation. The Maldives form one of the most extensive groups of atolls on Earth. There are more than 1,000 islands spread across the Indian Ocean, many of them with an average elevation of less than 2 meters above sea level. The reef rings create internal lagoons with shallow, clear water. The color varies according to depth and the type of seabed. Lake Baikal is the deepest lake in the world, reaching more than 1,600 meters. It contains about 20% of the planet's unfrozen surface freshwater. In winter, the surface freezes completely. The ice is thick enough to support vehicles, and in some areas its transparency allows you to see several meters below the surface. Mount Fuji rises to 3,776 meters in elevation and is an active volcano, although it has been dormant since the early 18th century. Its almost perfectly symmetrical shape results from successive layers of lava and ash. For much of the year, the summit remains covered with snow. The mountain stands out because it rises in isolation, without high mountain ranges surrounding it. Banff National Park lies within the Canadian Rocky Mountains. The landscape is the direct result of glacial action, which carved deep valleys and left behind glacial lakes. The intense color of the water in some areas comes from what is known as glacial flour, suspended mineral particles that reflect light. In summer, the contrast between water, forest, and rock becomes even more striking. Plitvice is made up of 16 lakes, connected by successive waterfalls. The natural barriers separating each level continue to grow through the deposition of calcium carbonate. The water is extremely clear, allowing submerged tree trunks and variations on the lake bed to be seen. The entire system functions as a constantly renewing landscape. Cappadocia was shaped by ancient volcanic eruptions that covered the region with thick layers of tuff. Over thousands of years, wind and rain sculpted the softer material, creating columns and cone-shaped formations known as fairy chimneys. Some of these structures were later carved by hand and transformed into shelters and underground spaces. The fjords of Norway are valleys carved by glaciers during the last ice age and later flooded by the sea. The side walls are steep and can exceed 1,000 meters in height. The water is often deep, even close to the shoreline. The contrast between vertical rock, waterfalls, and calm water defines the landscape. Monument Valley lies on the border between Arizona and Utah, within the Navajo Nation. The formations known as buttes are remnants of sandstone layers that resisted erosion. The rest of the terrain was worn away over millions of years. Some of these structures rise more than 300 meters high. Zhangjiajie, located in Hunan Province, is known for its quartz sandstone pillars rising vertically from the ground. Continuous erosion separated blocks that were once part of a single formation. Many of these pillars exceed 200 meters in height. Constant humidity keeps dense vegetation clinging to the slopes. The Atacama is considered the driest non-polar desert on Earth. In some areas, records show decades without measurable rainfall. The high altitude and the influence of the cold Pacific Current reduce cloud formation. The result is an extremely clear sky and a landscape where soil, salt, and rock remain completely exposed. If you followed this far, there are still a few lesser-known places ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. Socotra lies in the Indian Ocean near the Horn of Africa. Geographic isolation allowed species to develop that exist nowhere else on Earth. The most famous example is the dragon's blood tree, with its umbrella-shaped crown. The terrain combines limestone plateaus, mountains, and arid coastal plains. The Serengeti is a vast plain in East Africa, covering about 30,000 square kilometers. The terrain is predominantly open, covered with grasses and dotted with isolated rock formations known as kopjes. The landscape changes with the seasons. During the dry season, yellow tones dominate. During the rainy season, the green returns quickly. The Faroe Islands lie in the North Atlantic between Scotland and Iceland. The archipelago is of volcanic origin, with high cliffs and slopes covered with low vegetation. The climate is unstable, with constant winds and rapid changes in visibility. The landscape is defined by the direct relationship between ocean and vertical rock. Throughout this list, what repeats is not a specific type of landscape, but distinct natural processes: glacial erosion, volcanic activity, mineral deposition, geographic isolation, and the action of wind and water. Each place presented has its own formation logic. The beauty here is linked to the clarity of these forms and the scale at which they appear. These 25 places are distributed across different continents and climates. Some are the direct result of internal forces within the Earth, such as volcanism. Others depend on slow processes like erosion, sedimentation, and glacial action. All remain accessible because they still preserve their original characteristics on a large scale. If this type of content resonates with you, subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and which of these places would go first on your list? This video is a visual and narrative recreation, created with the support of artificial intelligence, for educational and entertainment purposes. The scenes are illustrative, and may not accurately represent real animal behaviors, or the environments portrayed.